Lesson 31. The pronouns hic, iste, ille, and ipse. Caesar, Book 1, Chapter 1, continued. Hi everyone, welcome back to Lenny's Latin class. Today we're on page 93, lesson 30, as I mentioned a moment ago. And the big thing that we need to do today is talk about demonstratives. A few lessons ago, we talked about some of the Latin demonstratives, mainly is, ea, id, if I remember correctly. And now it's time to talk about pretty much all the other demonstratives that exist in Latin. So let's just jump right in and start talking about these demonstratives. Okay, section 255 at the beginning of the lesson, it says demonstrative pronouns. So I want to stop right there for a moment and talk about that term. The term demonstrative pronouns really does not cover what these demonstratives are. Demonstrative pronoun, well, that's only part of the story. The words we're going to study in this lesson, these demonstratives, they can be both demonstrative pronouns and demonstrative adjectives. Okay, so these pronouns can function two ways. The primary demonstratives that we'll study in this lesson are the Latin words that mean this and that, just like this and that in English. And I believe I've explained this before, but it's worth explaining again. So I can use the English word this to explain what I'm saying, okay? So imagine the English word this, and imagine I have a cup in front of me, and I say this cup. In that particular example, the word this is functioning as a demonstrative adjective. Okay, we have the noun cup, and then the word this is an adjective modifying the word cup. So that's one way that demonstratives can work. They can function as adjectives that modify nouns. Another way they can work is on their own without any attached noun. Okay, imagine I'm sitting there at a table with a cup in front of me, and I point at the cup and I say, this is good. Okay, in that case, there is no noun attached to the word this. The word this is just sitting there by itself. And so it has a substantive kind of feeling to it. In other words, it's standing in for something. As we always say, the stock definition they give you for a pronoun is that a pronoun takes the place of a noun. And so in that particular case, the word this is functioning in a substantive kind of way. It's functioning as a pronoun because it's standing in for whatever I'm referring to. If I'm referring to the cup, or perhaps what's in the cup, we don't know. But either way, if I say this is good, the word this is a demonstrative pronoun. If I use it to describe or modify a noun and I say this cup, now it's no longer a demonstrative pronoun, now it's a demonstrative adjective. So the thing that I want to get you to understand here is that these demonstratives can function as demonstrative pronouns or demonstrative adjectives. So when the authors of the book here say demonstrative pronouns, that's true, they are demonstrative pronouns, but that's not the complete story. The whole story is that they're demonstrative pronouns and they can also function as demonstrative adjectives. Okay, so let's learn about the word hic, and that's how you say this in Latin. Okay, that's here in section 255. You can see a big chart, a paradigm of hic. And so masculine, feminine, and neuter in the nominative case are hic, haec, hoc. So we often refer to this demonstrative as hic, haec, hoc. Okay, so if you have a soldier, a miles, and you want to say this soldier, you can put hic with it. That's the nominative masculine singular form. So hic miles, this soldier. If it's a female, like the word femina, which means woman, you could put haec with it. That's the nominative feminine singular form. You could say haec femina, this woman. If it's a neuter thing, such as the word oppidum, which means town, you could say hoc oppidum, and that means this town. So you can use them as demonstrative adjectives like that, Or you can use them as demonstrative pronouns by themselves. You can just say hic, and it means this. You can say hike, and it means this. You can say hoc, and it means this. You can use these words to refer to people. If there's a man that you're talking about, you can say hic, and it means something like this guy. If you're talking about a woman, you could say hike, and it means this woman or this girl. If you're talking about a thing that's inanimate or has a neuter grammatical gender, you could say hoc, and that means this. You're talking about a thing. So when it comes to hic, hike, hoc, you can use them as adjectives or pronouns. If you want to talk about someone possessing something, you can use the genitive forms. Huius means of this thing or person. Huius is the same for each gender in the singular, of course. For indirect objects, you have the dative singular form, huic. So if you give something to this soldier, it would be huic militi. Okay, you'd put huic in the dative, and you'd have militi in the dative case, to this soldier. If it's a direct object, you would have hunc. If it's masculine, hanc. If it's feminine, hoc. If it's neuter. For example, if you want to say, I see this woman, you'd say video hanc feminam. Okay, so you can put hanc, the accusative singular form that's feminine, along with the accusative singular form of feminam, which means woman. So video hanc feminam, I see this woman. In the ablative, we have hoc, hac, and hoc. Masculine and neuter are the same. The word scutum in Latin is a neuter noun that means shield. So if you wanted to say, by means of this shield, you could put the ablative hoc along with the word shield in the ablative singular case and say, hoc scuto, by means of this shield. Or if you're pointing at the shield, you could just say hoc. You don't have to put shield. You can just use it as a demonstrative pronoun. Okay, so I'm just showing you a few simple ways to use hic, hike, hoc. All those same things apply in the plural. Okay, he would be for more than one male. Hi, H-A-E, is for more than one female or more than one feminine noun. Hike is neuter plural. Notice that for the neuter gender, as always, the nominatives and accusatives will be the same. So hike is neuter nominative plural and neuter accusative plural. Horum, harum, horum in the genitive plural. His, his in the dative and ablative. Hos, has, hike in the accusative. And if you have a group of people who are mixed, male and female, you would use he to refer to them. You'd use the masculine form. Okay, so if you have more than one soldier, and that's milites, you could say he milites, these soldiers. If you have more than one woman, and that's femini, you could say hi femini, these women. If you have more than one town, opida, you could say hike opida, these towns. Or you could just point to a group of men and say he, these, these guys, these people. Or you could point to a group of women and say, hi, these women, or point to towns and say, hike, these towns. Again, they can be demonstrative adjectives or demonstrative pronouns. Okay, let's move on to 256, and let's talk a little bit about the different kinds of pronouns that we have. We've covered hic, hike, hoc, and so I get the feeling that you get the idea with hic, hike, hoc. So let's talk about some of the other demonstratives here. We know that hic means this, and then if we want to say that, we need to use the word ille. Okay, that's I-L-L-E, ille, and it has all different declined forms, just like hic, hike, hoc does. So hic means this, ille means that. And here in 256, let's see what the authors of the book are saying. They're saying hic puer means this boy. So here we have an example of hic functioning as a demonstrative adjective. Hic is agreeing with, modifying puer. So it's an adjective, a demonstrative adjective. Hic puer means this boy. Skip over for the moment iste puer and go to ille puer. Ille means that. It's masculine. Puer means boy. And so ille puer means that boy. So hic means this, ille means that. So what is this other demonstrative, iste? What is that? What they're saying here in 256 is that on the third line, it says, these pronouns may be called demonstratives of the first, second, and third person, respectively. So what that means is that you can envision these demonstratives as being hic, meaning near the speaker, ille, meaning that it's near some third party, but iste is as if you're talking to someone in the second person. So iste is somewhere in the middle between hic and ille. In English, we have something like this when we say, if I'm talking to somebody about their own car, I could say, that car of yours, I could say, hey, that car of yours is pretty nice. When I do that, I'm referring to something that's near the person that I'm talking to. So in that sense, it has a second person kind of feeling to it. If I say, this car is nice, I'm referring to a car that's kind of near me, near the speaker. So it has a feeling of being a first person kind of statement. If I say, that car over there, that car is pretty nice. When I say that, there's the feeling that I'm referring to a car that's not near me and it's not near the person I'm talking to. The feeling is that I'm referring to a car that's over somewhere else. We're talking about that car. So in that sense, you can think of ille or that as being a third person kind of, having a third person kind of feeling or being a third person kind of statement. Okay, so when you say this, it's got kind of a first person feeling to it. When you say that thing of yours, it has a second person feeling. When you say that, it has a third person feeling. So that's what the authors of the book are saying here. They're saying that these pronouns may be called demonstratives of the first, second, and third person, respectively. That's what iste is doing here. Iste is a pronoun in Latin that has a second person kind of flavor to it. It's as if the thing you're referring to is connected with the person that you're speaking to. There's also another thing about iste in Latin that ought to be considered, and that is the idea that sometimes iste has a pejorative kind of meaning to it, a pejorative connotation. So what do I mean by that? Why would it be pejorative or negative or insulting to say iste? Okay, sometimes in Latin, they use the word iste like this. Imagine that you go to your neighbor's house to tell your neighbor that your neighbor's dog bit you on the leg. You might say, that dog of yours bit me on the leg. And when you say that, it's almost like you're trying to insult the dog. That dog of yours. It's got a connotation that there's something bad about it. It's hard to put into words. It's hard to fully express this. But you'll read this in textbooks. You'll read that iste can be used in sort of a put-down kind of way or a pejorative kind of way. So that's just something to be aware of. Quick review, hic haec hoc means this. You can envision it as being first person because it's near the person doing the talking, near the speaker. Iste means that thing near you, so it's associated with the person being spoken to and therefore has a second person kind of feeling to it. And then ille means that, something that's not near the speaker or the listener, and therefore it has a third person kind of feeling to it. Okay, let's turn to the appendix and look at the different forms of iste and ille. That's on page 258 in section 19 of the appendix. Let's start with ille, That's the third group down from the top, or the second group up from the bottom here on page 258. So in the singular nominative forms, we have ille, illa, and illud. So if you want to say that man, you'd say ille vir. If you want to say that woman, you'd say illa femina. And if you wanted to say that town, you'd say illud oppidum. So whatever you're putting it with, it has to agree in case, number, and gender with the noun that you're putting it with. And again, they can function as demonstrative pronouns. You can just say ille, and it means that, in the sense of that thing, that person. Oftentimes, ille simply means that guy, or that person. By the way, for those of you who study other languages besides Latin, such as Italian or French or Spanish, a lot of the articles that they have in those languages come from these Latin demonstratives. For example, in Italian, they have il. Okay, those are just surviving forms of ille. In Spanish, you have el and la. Those are just surviving forms of ille and illa. If you chop off the I and the L from illa, you have la. Same thing for French, although with a highly transformed pronunciation. So all those words in those languages that mean the articles, they're all just surviving forms of demonstratives such as ille. By the way, ille has some of the characteristics of a naughty nine word. Okay, notice that in the genitive singular, it's not ille with a long I, it's illeus. And in the dative singular, it's not illo with an O at the end, it's ille. So in the genitive singular and dative singular, it declines like a naughty nine word. For example, alius, words like that. So if you're reading a text and it says illo, that has to be ablative. It can't be dative, because dative would be ille. But besides that, most of the forms are pretty normal. In the genitive plural, you have orum, arum, and orum as the ending. Is as the ending for all the dative plurals and ablative plurals. Okay, so a lot of these forms match the endings that you would expect from first and second declension adjectives. You just have to make a note of the unusual forms like illud, illeus, ille. By the way, down at the bottom of the page is your old friend Isse, id. Might be a good time to review that too. Moving up one group up to Iste. In the nominative singular forms, we have Iste, Ista, and Istud. Notice again, just like ille, this has kind of a naughty nine sort of declension pattern with istius in the genitive singular and isti in the dative singular. You might expect there to be an O there. You might want it to be isto, right? Because that's the familiar second declension masculine ending. But it's not. It's got the long I, much like a naughty nine. I'm not going to continue spoon-feeding these forms to you because this is lesson 30. By now you've been around the block enough to have some basic familiarity with these different declined forms, these different endings. You need to be able to study these on your own at this point and get to know the different forms of these demonstratives. There's really nothing about them that you haven't already studied in some other form, either by looking at the first declension, the second declension neuters, or naughty nine words. Okay, you've seen all this before. You just have to make note of how it applies to these particular words. Moving on now to section 257, there's one other big pronoun that we're talking about here in this lesson, and that is ipse, I-P-S-E, ipse, and we call this the intensive pronoun. Why is it called the intensive pronoun? Because it emphasizes or reiterates a noun that you refer to. Very much like in English, when we use words like himself, herself, or itself. If I say the Queen of England came to a party, I might say the Queen herself came to the party. Okay, so when I say the word herself, It's like I'm emphasizing that it's actually the queen. I'm reiterating it or emphatically stating it. So that's what ipse does in Latin. Ipse is masculine, ipsa is feminine, ipsum is neuter. So the word regina means queen. So if I want to say the queen herself in Latin, I could say regina ipsa. If I want to say Caesar himself, I could say Caesar ipse, Caesar himself. The town itself, town is neuter, that's oppidum. I could say oppidum ipsum, the town itself. Okay, so that's how ipse, ipsa, ipsum works. Let's go back to the appendix for a moment to page 259, and we'll see a paradigm chart for ipse. They're in section 20. And you can see that it's very similar to iste and ille in its declension pattern. It's got pretty normal endings that you would expect from the first and second declension, except for in the genitive singular and dative singular. In those particular forms, it declines like a naughty 9 word. Genitive singular is not ipsi, as you might expect, it's ipsius. And dative singular is not ipso, as you might expect, it's ipsi. Okay, so you have that I there in the dative singular where you might expect an O. So all these demonstratives, hic, iste, ille, is id, idem, ipse, all these demonstratives have that naughty 9 kind of declension pattern. In each of those words, you'll see ius in the genitive singular form, and you'll see I with a macron as the dative singular ending. And if you can't remember what I am referring to when I say naughty 9, what I mean is that group of 9 adjectives that have that declension pattern. You can turn back to page 252 in the appendix, and you'll see alius, alter, neuter, and unus. Those are 4 out of that group of 9 adjectives known as the naughty 9 because they have ius as their genitive singular ending and a long I as the dative singular ending. They're called the naughty 9 because they don't behave themselves the way they're supposed to with an O as the dative singular masculine ending. So they're called naughty. Okay, back to our lesson now. Let's go to the top of page 94. There's one other way that ipse can be used. Sometimes it is good to translate it into English as the word very. And they give an example here. In ipsis fluminis ripis. In is a preposition that means in or on, and it takes the ablative. And then ripis is a first declension noun that means bank, like the bank of a stream or river. That's ablative plural, and it's being modified by ipsis. So ipsis and ripis together would say the banks themselves. In ipsis, ripis says on the banks themselves. And fluminis is genitive singular, so that's of the river. So this little phrase here says on the banks themselves of the river. So when we do it that way, it's a little clumsy in English. So we could make it a bit more eloquent, perhaps, if we say, on the very banks of the river. Somehow the word very has an intensifying factor. Rhetorically, it does kind of the same thing as if you say the banks themselves. So in some contexts, it might be good to use the word very to translate ipse, just depending on how it sounds in English. It's perfectly fine to say on the banks themselves of the river or on the banks of the river themselves, but it's a little bit clumsy and you may find it beneficial to smooth it out by saying very instead. One last note here about the genitive use of ipse. Here's a sample sentence. Ipsius copii visi sunt. Visi sunt, it's a long story, but it means they were seen. That's a compound tense. I don't believe we've covered that yet. Copii means troops. So copii And visi sunt says the troops were seen. And then ipsius here is genitive singular, and that's possessing copii. So it's the troops of him himself were seen. And if we say the troops of him himself, that sounds weird. It doesn't sound very smooth. So we can render that as his own troops. By throwing in the word own, somehow that has a kind of a strengthening effect. It's not just his troops, it's his own troops. It adds a little bit of strength to it. So I hope by now you're getting the feeling of what ipse does. It's an intensifying kind of word. It's a strengthening, emphasizing kind of word. And I think with a little bit of practice, you'll get accustomed to handling it in your translations. Let's move on now to section 258. That's our vocabulary section for this lesson. First we have Imperium, imperii. That's a neuter noun of the second declension, and it means, it can mean all kinds of things. It can mean command, control, as you see listed here. In ancient Rome, only certain political offices held imperium, and if you were an officer of the state, like consul or a high-ranking praetor, you would have imperium. And the way it's been explained to me is that imperium meant that you had the right to physically harm a Roman citizen. Certain Roman officials had kind of an entourage or a set of bodyguards called lictors, Lictors, lictors. And these lictors held like rods, and they could actually beat people with these rods. So if you were a very high-ranking official and you had lictors, you could tell the lictors to physically harm someone. So basically, imperium is a very strong privilege granted to someone. The privilege of command, the privilege to have their orders immediately carried out, even if it means harming someone. So if a certain official held imperium, that was a very powerful position to be in ancient Rome. Of course, we have related English words like empire and imperial. Moving on, we have humanitas, humanitatis. Of course, it's related to our English word human. This is a feminine noun of the third declension. The meaning that they're giving us here is civilization. Next, we have hic, haec, hoc, which means this. Of course, we've already covered it. We have the second person demonstrative iste, ista, istud. It has the idea of that in the sense of something that's near the person being spoken to. Therefore, it can be conceived of as a second person kind of demonstrative. Next, we have ille, illa, illud, which means that. It means that, as in that thing over there. It's not something near the speaker. It's not something near the person being spoken to. It's something that's over somewhere else. So in that sense, it can be conceived of as a third person kind of demonstrative. And as they say here, it can mean that, but used as a pronoun, it can mean that guy, that lady, that person, that thing. In literature, the word ille is often used to indicate a change of subject. For instance, if you're talking about one guy in a text, and then suddenly you want to refer to someone else, in the text, they'll start using ille. And what that means is now they're talking about a different person. So it can be used as a way to shift a reference to referring to a new person in a text. Moving to the top of the right-hand column, we have ipse, ipsa, ipsum. We've covered this thoroughly. That's an intensifying pronoun. We actually call it the intensive pronoun. And we discussed how it means himself, herself, or itself. But sometimes it sounds a bit smoother, a bit more eloquent to translate it as very. Next, we have an adverb, longe, which means far. Sometimes it means by far, if it's showing the difference between two things. Next we have propterea. That's an adverb that means on account of. Of course, propter on its own means on account of. And then ea is a form of is, ea, id. Ea would be neuter plural. So if you put propter and ea together, you get propterea. So propter and ea, two separate words, literally says on account of these things. Next, if you add quod, you get propterea quod. This is a very common thing that Caesar says in his texts. It means for the reason that. Sometimes I translate it as on account of the fact that. Next, we have the word well, that's vel. Well can mean or, and as you can see here, it's listed as a correlative. Well. So if you see it twice like that, it can mean either or. There are several ways to say or in Latin. I've been told that if you have two choices, like say right or left, then you would use the word out, which is A-U-T, out. If you have lots of choices, like, you can have coffee or tea or milk or orange juice or soda, in that kind of situation, you can use well to mean or. And if you want to say or in the context of a question, like would you like this or that, then you would use the word on, which is spelled A-N. So out is for when you have just two choices, well is for when you have lots of choices, and on is for questions. So each way to say or in Latin has a kind of a different flavor to it, a different usage. Next we have absum. That's simply the verb of being in Latin, which is sum, with the preposition ab in front of it. And so ab means from. And so literally absum means to be from, in the sense of being away from someplace. So absum means to be away or be absent. The infinitive is abesse. That's just esse with ab attached to it. And then fui is the perfect tense form of sum. And so you get just the letter A, you just get a in front of fui, and so you get a fui. Sometimes when you get frustrated with your Latin studies, you can say a fui. Sorry, little joke there. Moving on to the next one, concilio, conciliare, conciliavi, conciliatum. That's a first conjugation verb. That means to secure or gain. I'm not really sure of the etymology of that one. Moving on, we have interficio, interficere, interfeci, interfectum, which means to kill. When you read Caesar's Gallic Wars, there's lots of killing going on. In fact, in all Latin literature, people make fun of Latin literature sometimes. They say there's all kinds of different words for killing and dying, I did a bit of reading to try to figure out the etymology of this word and why inter plus facio would mean to kill someone. Inter in Latin means between, and then facio means to do or make. So literally it's to make between. And I found two explanations. One is that when you say something is between two other things, it separates those two things. So if you do between something, in that sense, you're splitting it in two or separating it. And so the idea there is to separate someone from life. That's one possible explanation that I read. Another more convincing explanation is that some people say that inter can also have the meaning of under. It's cognate with the German word unter and English under. So if you do someone under, it's kind of like in English when we say to cut someone down or bring someone down, or take someone down. So the most convincing etymology I could find is that this word means something like to do someone down or take them down, We don't always know how these words developed. Sometimes these are just very archaic words that develop a certain meaning very early on, and sometimes it's closely connected to the actual meanings of the words, like inter and facio. Other times it takes on sort of its own kind of specialized meaning that doesn't really add up from the words in the compound word itself. Sometimes the words that make up the compound do add up and it makes sense. Other times it doesn't make sense. It doesn't really add up. And the ancient Romans aren't always very helpful, because sometimes the ancient Romans would explain that a certain word got a meaning from some place that was just kind of, a weird story. Sometimes when the ancient Romans would explain their own words, even they would get it wrong. They wouldn't even know where the words came from. Next we have statuo. This is a third conjugation verb, so the principal parts are statuo, statuere, statui, statutum. I believe this word is related to the Latin word that means to stand. Okay, in Latin, sto means to stand. And this word possibly could have a causative kind of meaning to it, like to cause something to stand or to make it stand. And therefore, that's why it means to set up. I think that's the etymology here. And so it's related to words like statue, also statute. In English, a statute can be a rule or a law. So the meaning they're giving us here is to decide. That's the basic meaning of statuo, but I think it's built on the word that means to stand. Okay, let's go on now to section 259. That's our translation section for this lesson. Go ahead and turn off the recording and do all the exercises except for number 15. And then when you're done, turn the recording back on and we'll go over them together. Okay, hopefully by now you've completed your homework assignment. Let's go over the exercises together, starting with number 1. Exercise 1 says, Hic pagus Lucium Cassium consulem interfecit. Okay, the subject here is pagus. That means district, and hic means this. Hic is modifying pagus, so here it's working as a demonstrative adjective. Okay, so hic pagus says this district, and then the verb is interfecit. That's one of our new vocabulary words for this lesson. Interficio means to kill, and so interfecit is perfect tense, third person singular. So that's he, she, or it killed. And the direct object is Lucium Cassium. That's a person's name, Lucius Cassius. So what we have so far says this district killed Lucius Cassius. Finally, we have the word consulum. That's the third declension noun consul, which refers to one of the two yearly leaders of state, heads of state in ancient Rome. And notice that consulum is accusative singular along with Lucium and Cassium. So this word is just a noun telling us another thing about someone or something. So what we say is that the word consulum here is standing in apposition with Lucium and Cassium. The word consulum is an appositive. That's appositive, appositive. Okay, so when you just add another noun to say what someone is, we say that that noun stands in apposition. So number 1 says, this district killed Lucius Cassius, the consul. And what's being referred to here is that in Caesar's Gallic Wars, Caesar points out that the Helvetii, as a tribe, are divided into 4 different districts or cantons. And out of those 4 districts, he points out that one of those districts got into an earlier battle and killed a Roman consul. So he was talking about how that certain district was responsible for the death of a consul. So that's what's being referred to here. Number 2, he sunt extra provinciam transrhodanum primi. Here we have he, which is a form of hic, haec, hoc. It's nominative plural, so it means these. And here we have an example of hic, haec, hoc functioning as a demonstrative pronoun. In number 1, we saw hic functioning as a demonstrative adjective because it was modifying a noun, hic pagus. Here, he is not attached to any noun. It's standing on its own, and so it has a substantive kind of feeling to it. These, in the sense of these folks, these people. And the verb is sunt, so our subject and verb will say, these are. Later, we have a predicate adjective, primi. That's a form of the first and second declension adjective, primus, prima, primum, which means first. We have related English words such as primary. And so primi is nominative plural because it agrees with he. So he, sunt, and primi all together say, these are the first. Finally, we have a couple of prepositional phrases. Extra provinciam. Extra means something like beyond. And then provinciam, of course, means province. That's the province that the Romans had in the southern part of France, sometimes called Provincia, sometimes called Gallia Narbonensis. And then transrhodanum means across the Rhone. R-H-O-N-E, that's a river in France. So number 2 says, these are the first beyond the province across the Rhone. And to smooth out our translation a bit, we could throw in the word people along with primi. Primi is a substantive adjective. It means the first in the sense of the first people, the first tribesmen, the first, well, you get the idea. So number 2 says, these are the first people beyond the province across the Rhone. Number 3 is next. Horum fortissimi sunt Belgae, Proterreal Quote, ab humanitate provinciae longe absunt. Okay, let's start with fortissimi. Fortissimi is based upon the adjective fortis, which means things like brave or strong. And this is in a special form called a superlative. When you see the ISSI part of the word, that's a special section that we can add that makes it a superlative. What's a superlative? When we talk about adjectives, we say that they have 3 different degrees. Like the adjective good, if something is more good, we don't say it's gooder, we say it's better. So that's better in the sense of compared to good. So we call that a comparative adjective. But the word best, we call that a superlative. Good, better, best. The regular form of the adjective, we call that a positive because you're just stating what it is. So positive, comparative, superlative. Those are the 3 degrees that an adjective can have. So good, better, best, positive, comparative, superlative. Okay, so fortissimi is the superlative form of fortis. So it means bravest, and it's in the nominative plural. We'll translate fortissimi as bravest, and then sunt means are, and then Belgae means Belgians. Fortissimi sunt Belgae says the bravest are the Belgians. And of course, we're talking about people here. So we could, if we wanted to, throw in the word people or tribesmen. Horum is a form of hic, haec, hoc, one of our new demonstratives. And so this is genitive plural. So it means of these. So the first 4 words here will say something like this. Of these, the bravest are the Belgians. And again, if we wanted to, we could throw in a word like people and say, of these people, the bravest are the Belgians. Or we could say, of these, the bravest people are the Belgians. We don't have to do that, but we could if we wanted to, because that's understood or implied by the context. Next we have Proterreal Quote. That's a little phrase that means something like on account of the fact that, or because of the reason that, or here in this book they give a translation of for the reason that, which is just fine. Absent means to be absent or be away from. That's one of our new vocabulary words for this lesson. It's absum, which is the verb of being, sum, with the preposition ab attached to it. So absum means to be away from something or to be absent. We have the adverb longe here, which means by far or simply far. Okay, so what we have so far says, the bravest of these are the Belgians, for the reason that they are away by far. And now we're going to find out what they're away from, what they're far away from, okay? And then we have ab humanitate. Ab means from, and humanitate, that's one of our new vocabulary words for this lesson. Humanitas means civilization. The preposition ab takes the ablative, so humanitate is ablative singular. Provincii is genitive singular, and that's possessing humanitate. So ab humanitate provincii says from the civilization of the province. And what's being referred to here is that the Belgians are far away. They're up in the very northern part of Europe. They're far away from the culture and refinement of the, Roman province down in the south. So according to Julius Caesar, because they're the furthest away from civilization, they're also the toughest and strongest and bravest because they're not soft. They haven't gone soft because of the refinement and the pleasures of civilization. Okay, so number 3 says, of these, the bravest are the Belgians, for the reason that they are away by far from the civilization of the province. Or we could smooth things out a bit and say, of these, the bravest are the Belgians, for the reason that they are far away from the civilization of the province. We can simply say, they are far away, and smooth it out a bit. Number 4 is next. Ille locus. Okay, we're practicing with the different forms of ille here. Locus means place, that's nominative singular and masculine. And so ille is modifying it. Ille means that. And since ille is modifying a noun, we can say that ille here is acting as a demonstrative adjective. So number 4 says, that place. Number 5, illud bellum. This is very similar to number 4, except we have a neuter noun, and it's being modified by a neuter form of ille. Bellum means war. That's a second declension noun that's neuter. And then illud is the nominative singular neuter form of ille. So number 5 says, that war. Keep in mind that illud bellum could be nominative or it could be accusative, because when it comes to neuter nouns and pronouns, the nominative and accusative always look the same. Number 6 is next. Illo concilio. Concilio is a second declension noun, concilium, and concilium means things like a plan or perhaps counsel. Here it's ablative singular, so we might say by means of a plan, and illo is modifying it. That's a form of ille. So illo agrees with concilio in case, number, and gender. That means that illo has to be neuter ablative singular. So number 6 says, by means of that plan, or perhaps by that plan. Again, illo is a demonstrative adjective. And by the way, when we look at illo concilio, we know that it cannot possibly be dative. Concilio could be dative, but with illo modifying it, that gives it away that it has to be ablative because illo is not the dative singular form of ille. Remember that those demonstratives decline like naughty 9 adjectives. So in the dative singular, it would have an I as its ending. It would be ille. So if this were dative, it would be ille concilio. So because it's illo concilio, we know right off the bat that it's ablative. Okay, so that's just a quick reminder for dealing with these demonstratives. Number 7 is next. Illa pars equitum tela yacit. Our verb here is yacit. That's a form of the verb yacio, which means to throw or cast. And this is perfect tense, and it's third person singular. So yacit says he, she, or it threw, or he, she, or it cast. The subject here is pars, that means part. So the part cast, or the part threw. What did they throw? They threw tela, that means missiles, javelins, spears. For the sake of simplicity, we can just say javelins. So the part threw javelins. That's what we have so far. Pars is being modified by illa. Pars is a third declension feminine noun. And so we have a feminine form of ille modifying it. So illa pars says that part. Illa is nominative, singular, and feminine. That part threw javelins. Now we have the word equitum. That's a form of the third declension noun eques, which means cavalrymen. This is the part of the army where people are riding on horses. So equitum is genitive plural. So it means of the cavalrymen. So illa pars equitum says that part of the cavalrymen. And we can smooth things out a bit by saying that part of the cavalry. Okay, so number 7 says that part of the cavalry threw javelins. Number 8 is next. Finitimis ille agros dederunt. Our verb here is dederunt. That's a form of the verb do, which is a first conjugation verb that means give. It's a little bit irregular. It's not a completely regular first conjugation verb. The 4 principal parts are do, dare, dedi, datum. If it were completely regular, we might expect do, dare, dawi, or something like that. But it's really dedi for the perfect stem. Dederunt is perfect tense, third person plural. So dederunt means they gave. And here we do have a separate word to be the subject. That's ille. That's a form of ille, and it's nominative plural, masculine. So literally, ille and dederunt says this: those gave. And since ille is not modifying any noun, we can say that it's working as a demonstrative pronoun. It's got a substantive feeling to it. It stands in for something. So we could add in a word like people. We could say those people, those folks, or we could just translate it as they. But translating it as they, it's not quite as strong as what's here in the text. The text is really pointing out those folks, those people. So let's translate ille as those people, and then dederunt is they gave. So ille and dederunt says those people gave. What did they give? They gave agros, that's accusative plural, and it means fields. So those people gave fields. And here we have a true example, a genuine example of an indirect object, and that's finitimis. That's a form of the noun finitimus, which means neighbor. It's related to the noun finis, which means border, because it's people who border you. They're people who are close to your borders. And finitimis is dative plural. That's a classic example of an indirect object. That's the party that is benefiting or receiving in the sentence. So classic case of indirect object in the dative case. So number 8 says, those people gave fields to the neighbors. And the idea is that they gave the fields to their own neighbors, to their neighbors. So we can actually throw in the word their, because that's what's implied here in the text. And so we can say, those people gave fields to their neighbors. Number 9 is next. Ipse in Italiam Magnus Itinerabus contendit. Okay, let's take a look at the verb that's contendit. The verb contendo can mean several different things. It can mean to hurry someplace, that is to hasten. It can mean to fight, to struggle or strive. In this particular case, it means to hurry or hasten somewhere. And contendit, actually, that form could be present tense or perfect tense. So it could be he, she, or it is hurrying or hastening, or it could be he, she, or it hurried or hastened, perfect tense or present tense. We do have a separate noun to be the subject, and that's the pronoun ipse. Here it's sitting there by itself. It's not modifying anything. So it's a demonstrative pronoun, more specifically an intensive pronoun. And it's masculine, singular, and nominative. So we could say something like he himself. So ipse plus contendit says something like he himself is hastening or he himself hastened. We have a prepositional phrase in Italiam. The preposition in here is taking the accusative case. So in this context, it means into. He himself is hastening into Italy, or he himself hastened into Italy. And then finally, we have Magnus Itinerabus. Itinerabus is a form of the noun iter, the third declension neuter noun, that can mean things like march, road, way, journey, trip. And it's ablative plural because it's ablative of means. So what we have so far says, he himself is hastening into Italy by means of marches. Itinerabus is being modified by Magnus. Magnus is also ablative plural. Of course, it has to be. It has to agree with Itinerabus. So Magnus Itinerabus means something like by means of long marches or by means of great marches. Sometimes if you are reading a commentary, you'll see this defined as forced marches. And so a forced march, as far as I can tell, the idea of a forced march is that it's a march that has a time limit to it, a time requirement, a speed requirement, and is probably longer and faster than what would be comfortable to do. So a forced march is when the soldiers have to really hurry someplace and get someplace fast. They might have a heavy load. It might be a long distance. So a long, hurried march is kind of what a forced march is. And so magnum iter, in Latin, that means a forced march. And here it's ablative plural, by means of forced marches. So number 9 says, he himself is hastening or hastened into Italy by forced marches. Number 10 is next. Ipse in eorum finibus bellum gerunt. The verb here is gerunt. That's a form of the verb gero, which means to carry or bear. It's third person plural, so it means they carry or they bear. And it's working along with the word bellum, which means war. And so we'll translate it as they are waging war. We have a separate word to be the subject, that's ipse, that's nominative plural. So we can translate it as they themselves. So what we have so far would say they themselves are waging war. And then finally we have a phrase here, in eorum finibus. In is a preposition. It's taking finibus as its object, and it's being possessed by eorum. In finibus literally means in the borders. So if you're in the borders of some place, like inside the borders, that means you're in that territory. So we can translate the idea of being in someone's borders as being in someone's territory. Okay, so what we have so far would be they themselves are waging war in the territory. And then eorum here is possessing finibus. It's the territory of them. Okay, eorum is a form of id. We studied that a few lessons ago. It's that pronoun that can mean he, she, or it can mean, in certain circumstances, this or that. And sometimes it has kind of a weak demonstrative feeling, and in my opinion, can even be translated as the. So it's the kind of demonstrative pronoun that's not so forceful. It's not quite as strong as hic or ille. Here we have it in the genitive plural, so it means of them. So we can translate eorum with the English word their, their. So we can say they themselves are waging war in their territory. But the thing to notice here is that eorum refers not to the subject of the sentence, but to somebody else. So whoever the Ipse is, that's not the territory they're fighting in. It's not their own territory, but the idea is that they're waging war in the territory of someone other than the subject, some other folks. So let's say that Ipse is referring to the Romans. Ipse, the Romans themselves, are waging war in the territory of them, meaning someone other than the Romans. If the sentence were going to say that they were fighting in their own territory, they would use the adjective suus, sua, suum, and make it agree with finibus. So then it would say, Ipse in suis finibus bellum gerunt. They themselves are waging war in their own territory. But with eorum, really that's just the plural of eus. Eus, we talked about, means his, her, or its, meaning that it belongs to someone else other than the subject of that part of the sentence. So eorum is really just the plural of eus. And you can check the paradigm chart of isse id if you want for a little bit of extra study. So the sense of number 10 is they themselves are waging war in their territory, in the sense of the territory of someone else. Number 11 is next. Ipsorum lingua Celtae nostra Galli appellantur. Okay, this is similar to what we saw in Caesar's Gallic Wars when we read that short beginning part of it a couple of lessons ago. When we first saw that section, we had not studied Ipse, and so now that we've studied Ipse, they're giving us that sentence again for review or for extra study. So let's look at the verb here. Appellantur, that's the verb appello, which means to call someone something or to name someone something. And it's third person plural, present tense. So it says they are named or they are called. Okay, and then lingua is the first declension noun lingua, which means language or tongue. And here it's ablative singular. Notice the macron over the letter A. And that's an ablative of means. And so lingua and appellantur together say they are called in the language. And then ipsorum is possessing lingua. Ipsorum and lingua together say in the language of they themselves. And what are they called? Celtae. Okay, so ipsorum, lingua, Celtae, and appellantur together say in the language of they themselves, they are called Celts. Now we have the word nostra. That's the adjective noster, nostra, nostrum, which means our, O-U-R. And here it's ablative singular, feminine. And this is a substantive adjective. It's saying by means of our, but the thing that's understood here is the language. It's saying by means of our language. If they had wanted to, they could have inserted the word lingua again and said nostra lingua, but they didn't need to do that really because it's implied or understood by the context. Okay, so nostra is a substantive adjective. Okay, so after the word nostra, just imagine the word lingua there in the ablative singular. So number 11 says, in the language of they themselves, they are called Celts. In our language, Gauls. Galli is nominative plural, working along with nostra and appellantur. Number 12 is next. Consules ipsi. Consul is a third declension noun. That's one of the two heads of state that the Romans would elect each year. And consules is nominative plural. So consules means consuls, and then ipsi is the intensive pronoun, which we can simply translate as themselves. So number 12 can say, the consuls themselves. Number 13 is next. Orgetorix illis regna conciliabit, Proterreal Quote, Ipse, Suicuatatus, Imperium obtenebit. Okay, we have two clauses here. The first one is the word orgetorix, the beginning of the sentence, up through the word conciliabit. So let's translate that part of the exercise first. The subject here is orgetorix. He's one of the Gallic tribesmen. And what's he doing here? He's conciliabit. That's the verb concilio, which is one of our new vocabulary words for this lesson. It means to secure or gain. And notice the bi before the letter T. Okay, that bi is what we call an infix. It's a little chunk of text that gets added in before the personal ending, and that indicates future tense. So conciliabit means future. He will secure or he will gain. And what will he gain? Regna. Regna means kingships. Okay, remember that regnum is a second declension neuter noun that means kingship. And then we have an indirect object here, illis. That's a form of ille, which means that. And here it's dative plural. So the idea here is orgetorix will secure kingships for those people. Illis here is functioning as a demonstrative pronoun. It's not modifying anything. So it means those in the sense of those people, those guys, those folks. Okay, so the first part of the sentence says, orgetorix will secure the kingships for those people. And we can put people in parentheses because it's understood. Proterreal Quote means for the reason that. And then ipse is the intensive pronoun, meaning he himself, referring back to orgetorix. And the verb here in this clause is obtenebit. Again, that's future tense. Notice the B and the I before the personal ending. Obtenebit says he, she, or it will hold, he, she, or it will possess. And then imperium means something like command. Ipse, obtenebit, and imperium together say he himself will possess or he himself will hold the command. And then we have suicuatatus. Cuitatus is the third declension noun civitas, which means state, and it's genitive singular. So it's possessing imperium. So it's command of the state. And then we have sui here, which means his own, her own, or its own. In exercise 10, we saw eorum, which is just the plural of eos. That's the way you say his, her, or its, meaning someone other than the subject of the sentence. Now here in number 13, we're seeing sui. That's a suis, sua, suum. That's how you say his, her, or its, meaning that it belongs to the subject of the sentence. So here you can see how each of those are being used. Again, we translate them into English the same way as his, her, or its. So it's the same in English, but in the Latin, it has extra information packed into it. It tells you if it's his, her, or its belonging to the subject or someone other than the subject. So for suus, sua, suum, oftentimes they add in the word own, O-W-N, to say his own, her own, its own, to clarify that it belongs to the subject. So here in this clause, we could say, for the reason that he himself will hold the command of his own state. So we can add in the word own to show that sui is referring back to Orgetorix's own state. Number 14 is next. Eodem tempore Caesar per exploratores cognoit hostes esse prope ipsius castra. Okay, in this exercise, we have some indirect discourse, otherwise known as indirect speech. So we have a main clause, and then we have some indirect speech. Let's take the main clause first. That's everything up to cognoit. Cognoit is a form of the verb cognosco, which means to learn or find out. So it's third person singular, perfect tense. So it means he, she, or it learned. And then Caesar is the subject. So Caesar learned. Per exploratores means through scouts. Explorator means scout. So Caesar learned through scouts. And now we have tempore. Tempore is a third declension noun that means time. It's tempus temporis, a neuter noun of the third declension. Here it's ablative singular because it's ablative of time when. It's telling us at a certain time. Along with it, we have eodem. We haven't seen this in a while. This is a form of edem, which means the same. Eodem, that's just eo, a form of ille, with dem attached to the end. So it's ablative singular right along with tempore. Eodem and tempore say together the same time, but since it's an ablative of time when, what it really means is at the same time. Okay, so we have lots of meaning packed into those two words. Eodem means same, tempore means time. They're both ablative, so together they say at the same time. Okay, so the beginning clause here says, at the same time, Caesar learned through scouts. Okay, so we've talked many times about indirect discourse or indirect speech or indirect statement, how it starts out with a verb of the head or heart, a verb of speaking, a verb of saying, a verb of repeating, knowing, learning, feeling. All those kinds of verbs can set off indirect speech. And so then the indirect speech tells us the message that's being relayed of what someone said, what someone felt, what someone learned. And to get us started with that in our English translation, we need to throw in the word that. So here's what we do. We say, at the same time, Caesar learned through scouts that. And now we translate the rest. Hostes esse prope ipsius castra. Okay, within the indirect speech part of the sentence, we're going to have the accusative plus infinitive pattern. In indirect discourse, the subject of the sentence is in the accusative and the verb is in the infinitive. So here, that's hostes and esse. Hostes is a form of the third declension noun hostis, which means enemy. Here it's accusative plural. At the same time, Caesar learned through scouts that the enemies. Okay, and that's how we're going to start out here. Now we have the infinitive esse, which means to be. Prope means near. Castra means camp. Prope and castra together say near the camp. Prope takes the accusative. Castra is accusative. Castra is one of those nouns that's always plural. So castra is neuter accusative plural. Finally, we have ipsius. That's a form of ipse, the intensive pronoun. Remember that ipse declines like a naughty 9 adjective. So here, ipsius, that tells us that it's genitive singular. So the idea is that it's the camp of he himself, his own camp, in other words. Ipsius is possessing castra. Okay, so number 14 says, at the same time, Caesar learned through scouts that the enemies were near the camp of he himself. Or I suppose you could say of him himself. One last note before we go from number 14. I want you to take a look at Cognoit and Esse. In the indirect statement part of the sentence, we have esse as the verb. That is a present tense infinitive. Cognoit is perfect tense, so it says Caesar learned in the past. When you have a present tense infinitive in the indirect speech part of your sentence, what you do is you put that verb, that infinitive, in the same tense as the tense of the main verb. So cognoit is in a past tense. It's in the perfect tense. So we need to reflect that along with esse. So we're going to say, Caesar learned that the enemies were. We're not going to say, Caesar learned that the enemies are. Even though esse is present tense, what we're going to do is put it in the same time scheme as cognoit. I know this is a little bit complicated, and you're going to learn more about this in the future when you learn about the different tenses of infinitives. So in Latin, we have different tenses of infinitives. We have a present tense infinitive, we can have future infinitives, and we can have perfect tense infinitives. For right now, I just want to point out one simple thing to you, and that is that when you have a present tense infinitive in your indirect speech, it needs to be translated in the same tense or same time scheme as the main verb that set off the indirect speech in the first place. So even though esse is present tense, we're going to translate it as past so that it's in the same time scheme as cognoit, which is perfect tense. So we're going to translate esse as was, not as is. Okay, so number 14 says, at the same time, Caesar learned through scouts that the enemies were near the camp of him himself. And of course, we can translate enemies as a collective and just say enemy. Okay, let's skip number 15. And so that brings us to the end of our translation section for this lesson. Okay, let's move on now to section 261. That's our Caesar translation section for this lesson. So we'll pick up from where we stopped last time. So let's jump right in at the first line, and let's take the first section here up to the word belgae. It says, horum omnium fortissimi sunt belgae. Okay, we talked a few minutes ago about fortissimi. That's a superlative adjective. It's based on the third declension adjective fortis, which means brave. So the idea here is bravest, and so it's nominative plural. Okay, with adjectives you can have positive, comparative, or superlative, like good, better, best. Good is positive, better is comparative, best is superlative. Okay, so that's what we have here with fortissimi. The bravest, meaning the bravest people, the bravest soldiers, the bravest men. It's a substantive adjective. Then sunt means they are, and belgae means Belgians. So fortissimi, sunt, and belgae together say, the bravest are the Belgians. Horum omnium means of all of these. Okay, horum is a form of hic, which we studied in this lesson. So we have hic, haec, hoc, which means this, and horum is genitive plural. So it means of these. And omnium is the third declension noun omnis, which means all or every. Remember that third declension adjectives decline like I stem nouns. So we have the letter I before the um. Instead of omnum for genitive plural, we have omnium. So horum omnium says of all of these, or of all these. So the first section here says, of all these, the bravest are the Belgians. Moving on, Proterreal Quote, a cultu atque humanitate provinciae longissime absunt. Okay, you know Proterreal Quote, that means for the reason that, or on account of the fact that. And then on the third line, we have absunt. That means they are away, they are absent, they are distant. So of all these, the bravest are the Belgians for the reason that they are away. And so what are they away from? The cultu. Cultu is the ablative singular form of cultus, which means, as you can see in footnote 1, refinement. So a cultu means from the refinement. Atque means and humanitate, as we discovered earlier, means civilization. That's ablative singular. So the preposition a is taking cultu and humanitate. Okay, so the idea is that the Belgians are away from the refinement and the civilization. Provinciae is possessing cultu and humanitate, so it's from the refinement and civilization of the province. The word longissime is, as you can see in footnote 2, an adverb that means farthest. Notice that within longissime, we have the same issi as we see in fortissimi. Okay, that infix there tells you that it's a superlative. So longissime means farthest. It's a superlative adverb. So fortissimi, longissime, notice that pattern of the issi infix. So if we put all of this together in a translation that has a good English word order, it could go like this. For the reason that they are farthest away from the refinement and civilization of the province. Okay, let's take the next section, starting with minimeque. Minimeque ad eos mercatores, saepe comeiant, atque ea quae ad effeminandos animos pertinent, important. Okay, the first thing to point out here is the que ending at the end of the word minime. So this very first word is minimeque. So that's just, as footnote 3 indicates, it's the word minime with a special ending tagged on, que, and that means and. So it's as if we inserted the word and before the word minime. And this ending, que, Q-U-E, it can join together two words within a phrase, like you could say peanut butter and jelly, but it can also link together two clauses, as we see here. Que is flexible. It can link together things on a micro level or link together entire sentences. Okay, the subject here is mercatores. That means merchants. Saepe means often, and comeiant means something like to come and go or to go back and forth. So mercatores, saepe, and comeiant says merchants often go back and forth. Ad eos means to them. Eos is a form of isse, id, it's accusative plural. And so then again, minime means least or not at all. Really, it means not at all. So literally, what we have here is, and not at all do merchants often go back and forth to them. Okay, so it says merchants go back and forth often, but then they add in not at all. So it's not at all often. And so as you can see from footnote 3, they want you to translate it as very seldom, minime plus saepe. But literally, it's not at all often. So this section says, and not at all often do merchants go back and forth to them. Now we have atque, which means and the verb here is important. That's a form of the verb importo, which is really just porto, as footnote 4 indicates. Porto means carry, and then we have the preposition in added to it. In porto means to bring in or carry in, and the in the preposition in turns into an m, and so you get importo. So in this part of the sentence, we're still talking about what the merchants do and how they don't do it. We're still being governed by minime. So what we're reading here is not at all done by the merchants. Important is third person plural present tense, and it means they import. And then we have the direct object of important, which is ea. Ea is a form of is, ea, id. Okay, this happens to be accusative plural neuter. And so when you have a pronoun like this that's neuter, it has the feeling of being inanimate objects, things, stuff. So important and ea together say something like, they import the things, or they import those things. Now we have a relative clause, starting with the relative pronoun quae. Quae starts our relative clause, and the antecedent is ea. Quae will get its number from its antecedent, so it's plural because ea is plural. It will get its gender from its antecedent, so quae is neuter because ea is neuter. But quae will get its case from the role it plays in the relative clause. So here quae is nominative plural neuter, and it's the subject of the verb pertinent. Pertinent is a form of the verb pertineo, which means to extend or pertain, as we get the English word pertain from it. Okay, so what we have so far here says this, and merchants do not at all often go back and forth to them, and import those things which. So they import those things which, and now the relative clause is going to tell us more about the things. Quae and pertinent say which extend, and then we have ad effeminandos animos. Oftentimes with gerundives and gerunds, the preposition ad can mean for the purpose of. Here it just means to or toward. Ad animos means to minds or toward minds. Animus is a second declension noun that means mind. And animos is being modified by effeminandos. Effeminandos is a gerundive, otherwise known as a future passive participle, and it means to weaken. So here, as a gerundive, it will be translated as to be weakened. The idea here is future activity, activity that's passive, and activity that must happen, should happen, ought to happen. Ad effeminandos animos says something like, toward minds to be weakened. Okay, so literal translation, and not at all do merchants often go back and forth to them and import those things which pertain toward minds to be weakened. That's a literal translation. Again, we can translate minime and saipe together and say, very seldom. And then with ad effeminandos animos, we can do our usual hocus pocus there by making effeminandos active and then making it sound like animos is the direct object of that. So we can say toward the weakening of minds or toward weakening minds, something like that. So this section says, and very seldom do merchants go back and forth to them and import those things which pertain to weakening minds or to the weakening of minds. Let's take the next section here. Proximique sunt Germanis, qui trans Rhenum incolunt. Okay, there's no word here to be the subject. We're just going to reuse the Belgians that we're already talking about. So the subject here is the Belgians, although it's unstated. And then the verb is sunt. So the subject and verb is the Belgians are, or we could just say they are if we don't want to mention the Belgians again. Of course, we don't have to put in the word Belgians here in the translation. We can just say they. Okay, and now we have a predicate adjective, which is proximi. That's the first and second declension adjective, proximus, proxima, proximum, which can mean things like nearest or adjacent or bordering on. We can just say nearest. And notice that it's nominative plural because it's still talking about the Belgians. So what we have so far in this particular section would say, and they are nearest. Notice that at the end of the word proximi, we again have the que ending, the QUE special ending that means and. And they are nearest. That's what we have so far. Germanis is dative plural, and that means to the Germans. Okay, ordinarily we see the dative case used with verbs like persuadeo, or we see it used in a dative of possession, or we see it used to make an indirect object. Here it's just kind of a dative of reference, perhaps. So proximi and Germanis, nearest to the Germans. And now we have a relative clause, qui trans renum incolunt, starting with the relative pronoun qui. The antecedent of qui is Germanis. So this clause is going to tell us more about the Germans. So we'll translate qui as who. Qui is masculine and plural because its antecedent, Germanis, is masculine and plural. But qui is nominative because of the role it plays in the relative clause. It's the subject of the relative clause. And since it's the subject, it needs to be nominative. Qui means who, and incolunt means dwell. That's third person plural. So it's they dwell. Trans renum means across the Rhine. Traditionally, the Rhine River has been a big natural boundary between Germany on the east and France on the west. So even in the ancient world, it played the role of boundary like that. So when it says the Germans live across the Rhine, that means on the east side of the Rhine in traditional German territory. Okay, so this section of the reading says, and they are nearest to the Germans who dwell across the Rhine. Now we have yet another relative clause, starting with quibuscum. Okay, so this section is quibuscum continenter bellum gerunt. You're already familiar with bellum gerunt. That's a kind of an idiom that means to wage war. Gerunt is third person plural. So together, bellum and gerunt says they wage war. Continenter means continually. And quibus means with whom. Okay, remember when we studied relative pronouns, we studied the fact that with quibus, you can attach the preposition cum to the end. So instead of saying with whom as cum quibus, you can put the cum right on the end of the word quibus and say quibuscum. Okay, the antecedent of quibus is still the Germans. That's why it's plural, and that's why it's masculine. But it's ablative because it's the object, really, of the preposition cum. Cum here as the ending plus quibus says with whom. So this whole relative clause says with whom they continually wage war. Okay, let's move on to the next phrase. Let's just take qua de causa. As you can see from footnote 6, qua de causa is kind of a stock phrase that means, and for this reason. Literally, it means something like from which reason. De means from, qua means which. That's a relative pronoun. And causa, you know already, it means cause, reason, etc. So qua and causa are both objects of the preposition de, which takes the ablative. That's why they are ablative. So literally, from which reason, but we'll translate it as the author's wish. and we'll say, and for this reason. The next little section is Helvetii quoque reliquos Gallos virtute praecedunt. Okay, the subject is Helvetii, the verb is praecedunt, which means to excel or surpass. It's really based on the verb cedo, which means to go, move, or yield. And prae means in front of. So prae and cedo makes praecedo, which means to go in front of. So if you're in front of others, you're ahead of them, you're surpassing them. This is where we get our English word precede. The English prefix pre, which means before, comes from this prefix prae, prae. The a goes away, and you just get the p, the r, and the e. So in English, pre means before. So if you preheat your oven, you heat the oven up in advance of when you need it. So that pre prefix is really prae. You're not just preheating your oven, you're preheating it. But the a goes away, and so you get pre. Okay, so Helvetii and praecedunt, together they say the Helvetii surpass. Quoque means also or and Gallos is the direct object of praecedunt. Okay, so the Helvetii are surpassing the Gauls, the Gallos, and reliquos means remaining. Okay, so the Helvetii also surpass the remaining Gauls. And now we have an ablative of respect. That's virtute. Virtute is a form of the third declension noun, virtus, which means valor, manliness, things like that. And here it's in the ablative case, so the idea is with respect to valor or in valor. So this section of the reading says, and for this reason, the Helvetii also surpass the remaining Gauls with respect to valor. Or you could also say in valor. Moving on to the next section. Quod fere quotidianis proiliis cum Germanis contendunt. Quod means because, and so now this little part of the sentence is going to tell us the reason why they surpass all the other Gauls. Quod says because, and contendunt is the verb. That means they strive or they fight. That's present tense. So what we have so far says, because they fight. Proiliis is a form of the second declension noun proilium, which means battle. Here it's ablative plural, and it means something like in battles. The word quotidianis is a first and second declension adjective. Quotidianus, quotidiana, quotidianum, which means daily. Quotidianis, proiliis, says in daily battles. And fere says almost. Okay, so this part of the reading says, because they fight in almost daily battles with the Germans. Cum Germanis means with the Germans. Okay, let's move on to the next phrase, which is the last phrase. Cum aut suis finibus eos prohibent, aut ipse in eorum finibus bellum gerunt. Okay, let's start with the word cum. You're accustomed to using the word cum as a preposition that means with. Okay, we've seen that a lot in ablative of manner, with great speed, expressions like that. And that's true. Cum is a preposition that means with. However, the word cum also in Latin can mean other things. It can also be a conjunction. It's kind of a long story, but basically cum can mean when, it can mean under the circumstances that, it can mean since, or it can mean although. In fact, there's a whole group of clauses called cum clauses that you will study as you get more advanced. Here we have a very simple Kum clause. This is called a Kum Temporal Clause. Temporal means related to time, and so we call it a Kum Temporal because the word cum here means when. So it's simply referring to timing or time. So long story short, cum here means when. Earlier in the lesson, I mentioned that there are several ways to say or in Latin, and I talked about how the word out, that's a A-U-T, is used when there are two choices, like two possibilities, this or that, left or right. And so here we see that very thing. We see two parts of the sentence being coordinated by the word out. Out here, A-U-T, out, is a correlative. So we have the first out meaning either, and then the second out meaning or. So out, suis finibus eos prohibent, out, ipse in eorum finibus bellum gerent. Okay, so it's either this or that. That's the structure of the sentence. One other thing to mention, in this first part of the sentence that says out suis finibus eos prohibent, here we have the word suis, which is going to be referring back to the subject. Remember, that's suis, sua, suum, which means his own, her own, its own, their own. Then in the second part, where it says out ipse in eorum finibus bellum gerent, in that part we have eorum, which is just the plural form of eos. So notice how each of those will be translated as their, T-H-E-I-R, but suis is going to refer to the Helvetii because they're the subject, and eorum is going to refer to someone other than the Helvetii because the Helvetii are the subject. So this is a good chance to practice understanding the difference between suis, sua, suum, and eos, or in this case, the plural form of eos, which is eorum. Remember that eorum and eos are forms of is, ea, id. They are genitive, so they're able to possess things. Okay, suis, sua, suum is just an adjective that means his, her, or its. So suis has a structural difference. It agrees with something because it's an adjective. Eos and eorum are pronouns that possess something in the genitive case. Okay, different structure, but they both do kind of the same thing. They say who something belongs to. Okay, so let's tackle the out suis finibus eos prohibent. Prohibent is the verb. That's the verb prohibeo, and that means to stop someone, to prohibit someone. In fact, that's where we get the word prohibit. It means to keep somebody out of something. It means to maybe prevent. Let's translate it as keep out. Prohibent says they keep out, and there is no separate word here to be the subject. We're still just talking about the Helvetii. So we can put the word Helvetii in our translation, or we can put the word they with the knowledge that it's referring to the Helvetii. And eos is accusative plural. That's the people that are being kept out, referring to the Germans. So eos and prohibent together will say they keep them, eos, out. Suis finibus, both of those words are ablative plural. Finibus is the ablative plural form of finis, which means border. Okay, so when we see the word border in the plural like this, it can mean territory. Literally, it says they keep them out from their own borders. Why does it mean from their borders? The ablative case has many different uses. There are lots of things that it can mean. And the meanings of the ablative case don't necessarily need any help from helper words such as prepositions. In fact, the most fundamental use of the ablative case is what we call ablative of separation. In fact, the word ablative means to carry something away. The word ablative is ablative. So the first two letters, ab, that's the Latin preposition from, and then lat, that root word, is the same root word as pharaoh, which means to carry. The word ablative literally means the carrying away case. Sometimes I joke around and I say, it's easy to get carried away with the ablative, right? Little joke there. But in all seriousness, the case itself, as reflected in the name, carries with it the idea of taking something away from something. So in Latin, you can use the ablative case to show separation, that something is moving away from something. And in order to do that, you do not need a preposition. You don't need ab or de. Just a bare ablative will do that, because the ablative case just contains that meaning within the case itself. Okay, again, suis, that's suus, suasum, it's referring to the subject of the sentence. It means there in the sense of belonging to the subject, which in this case is the helvetii. So this part of the sentence says, when either they keep them out from their territory, meaning the helvetii's territory. Eos means them, that's the Germans. Suis finibus, that means their own territory, referring to the territory of the helvetii. So that's the either part of the sentence. Now the or part, the part that says, aut ipse in eorum finibus bellum gerunt. The subject of the sentence here, in this part of the sentence, still is the helvetii. So gerunt means they bear or they carry, referring to the helvetii bear or the helvetii carry. And it's working along with the word bellum, which means war. So we have this little expression that says to wage war. So the helvetii bellum gerunt, they wage war. And we have the intensive pronoun here, ipse, in the nominative plural, and that's strengthening or intensifying the subject, which is the helvetii. So we could translate ipse, if we wanted to, as the helvetii themselves, or they themselves, referring to the helvetii. So the first part of the sentence says, when either they keep them out of their own territory, and now, or when they themselves wage war in eorum finibus. In and finibus says in the territory. Remember, that's the word finis being used as a plural. So in the borders of some place means in the territory. And now notice that it's being possessed by the genitive eorum. Remember that eus means his, her, its, or their, but referring to someone other than the subject. So in eorum finibus says in their territory, but not the helvetii. It means someone else. And so who else is there? Well, it's referring to the Germans. So this last part here says this: when they either keep them out from their own territory, or when they themselves wage war in their territory, referring to the territory of the Germans. Okay, that's it for this lesson. Thanks for all your hard work. Thanks for listening. Remember to try to speak Latin each day. Try to say something in Latin just for practice. And if you do, you'll find that you'll learn the language faster and better. So again, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time in Lesson 32.